Claire Whitman, James Whitman, and Emily Carter. 3 names tied together by love, betrayal, and one careless text message that would unravel everything. What began as an accidental message meant for a secret lover spiraled into a story of obsession, deception, and murder. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, where nothing ever seemed out of place, a single vibration on a phone was enough to ignite a chain of events that destroyed 3 lives forever. On a Sunday evening, the town of Willow Creek was settling into its usual quiet rhythm. Families were returning from church, children were finishing their homework, and the streets were empty except for the occasional car heading home. Inside a modest house on Cedar Lane, Claire Whitman sat on the couch with her phone in hand. She wasn't expecting anything unusual. Her son was asleep upstairs, and James, her husband, had gone out for what he called a late meeting with a client. For Claire, it felt like just another evening. Then, the message arrived. At first glance, it didn't seem alarming. It wasn't even directed at her. But as her eyes lingered on the words, she felt her stomach twist. The message was short, warm, and filled with an intimacy that had no place on her phone. It ended with a heart emoji. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, and yet the tone of the message was unmistakable. Whoever sent it believed they were writing to James. Whoever sent it wasn't just a friend or colleague. For a long moment, Claire stared at the phone, waiting for an explanation to present itself. Maybe it was a mistake, she thought. People sent texts to the wrong numbers all the time. But deep down, she knew this wasn't an accident. It was too personal, too revealing. 1,000 thoughts rushed into her mind. Had James been unfaithful? How long had this been going on? Was this why he had been working late so often? She placed the phone on the coffee table, but it felt impossible to look away from it. Every second that passed seemed to stretch out, pulling her deeper into unease. Her heart pounded as if the text had opened a door she could never close again. She tried to calm herself, telling herself not to jump to conclusions. Yet the more she replayed the words in her mind, the less room there was for denial. That night, Claire didn't confront James. When he returned home, she pretended to be asleep. She listened to his footsteps, his casual movements, and even the sound of him brushing his teeth. Everything seemed so ordinary, and yet nothing felt the same. She wondered how long she had been living beside a stranger over the next few days. The message consumed her. She checked James's phone whenever she could, but he had grown cautious. His device was never left unattended anymore. He carried it to the bathroom, kept it close while he slept, and placed it face down on the table when they ate together. To anyone else, this behavior might have seemed harmless, but to Claire, it was a confirmation of everything she feared. The text replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She couldn't tell anyone about it, not even her closest friends. In a small town like Willow Creek, news traveled faster than the wind, and gossip had a way of distorting the truth until it became unrecognizable. Instead, she carried the secret alone, letting it grow heavier by the day. The more she thought about it, the more she noticed things she had once ignored. James had started working late more often, and his explanations were vague. He seemed distracted. At home, often lost in thought, and his smiles felt forced. At night, he turned away from her in bed, leaving her staring at the ceiling with questions that never ended. By the end of the week, Claire had become a different person. The calm, steady woman who once trusted her husband without hesitation had been replaced by someone suspicious, restless, and watchful. She began tracking his movements, keeping mental notes of where he said he would be and when. She checked receipts in his pockets, studied his clothes for unfamiliar scents, and searched for traces of a life he might be living outside their home. What began as a single message had quickly become an obsession. She couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep without waking in the middle of the night, and couldn't look at James without wondering who he truly was. It felt as if the walls of their marriage were crumbling, brick by brick, leaving her exposed to a storm she hadn't seen coming. By the time the next Sunday rolled around, Claire wasn't the same woman who had received that text. The seed of doubt had already taken root, and no matter how hard she tried to suppress it, it continued to grow. The message had been short, but its consequences were endless. Claire knew she was standing on the edge of something that could destroy everything she had built. What she didn't know was how far she would eventually fall, and how many lives would be caught in the collapse. Claire's discovery of the truth began quietly, almost invisibly. She didn't stumble upon it in some dramatic way. Instead, it revealed itself in fragments, small details that only became clear when strung together. A receipt tucked into the pocket of James's jacket showed a dinner for two at a restaurant. They had never visited as a couple. His work truck appeared parked late at night on a street that had no connection to any job he claimed to be working on. And then, there were the messages, short exchanges, coded in a way that was careful. But not careful enough. Claire pieced them together with growing dread until one fact became undeniable. The text she had received was not a mistake. It was a slip, a crack in the secrecy that James and Emily had built. Emily was younger, full of the kind of energy Claire once had before life became a cycle of routines. She worked part-time at James's construction company, often running errands or assisting in the office. To outsiders, she was cheerful, friendly, and harmless. But to Claire, she became the face of betrayal. It wasn't just that James had been unfaithful. It was that he had allowed someone else to step into the private world they had spent years creating together. Claire kept her silence, choosing to play the role of the unsuspecting wife while she collected more pieces of the truth. Each day at the school where she taught, she smiled for her students and colleagues, but the weight of what she knew pressed against her every moment. At home, she grew quieter, studying James as though he were a stranger under interrogation. She noticed how his phone lit up at odd hours, how he avoided her eyes when explaining where he had been, and how he carried a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The most painful part was how normal everything appeared on the surface. Neighbors still waved when the family drove by. Friends complimented them on being such a stable couple. Even her son, innocent and unaware, looked at his parents with trust. Yet behind that fragile image was a truth Claire could no longer ignore. The life she had believed in was cracking apart, and she was the only one who could see it. She began documenting everything. In a small notebook she kept hidden in her bedside drawer, Claire wrote down times, locations, and any suspicious detail she could find. She recorded the night James said he was working late, only to return with traces of perfume on his shirt. She noted the mornings when he left early, claiming to meet a client before sunrise. Her notes grew longer each week, filling pages with evidence that she had no one to share with. The secrecy weighed heavily on her mind. At times, she thought of confronting Emily directly, but fear held her back. Confronting James was an option, too, but she wasn't ready. She wanted to be certain, to have proof so undeniable that neither denial nor excuses could erase it. Until then, she endured the quiet torture of pretending nothing was wrong. Those who knew Claire began to notice changes in her. Her once bright eyes seemed dulled, her smile more forced. She lost weight, skipped meals, and seemed restless even in moments of stillness. When asked if she was all right, she brushed it off with polite excuses. Nobody could imagine the storm that was building beneath her calm exterior. The betrayal cut deep because James wasn't just her husband. He was her anchor, the person she had built her future around. To realize that he had shared his affection, his time, and his trust with someone else felt like a wound that refused to close. The simple text had pulled back the curtain on a truth she never asked to see, and now every detail of her marriage looked suspicious. Claire's thoughts grew darker as weeks passed. She found herself replaying scenarios in her mind, imagining what James and Emily talked about, where they went, what promises they made to each other. Every imagined detail was sharper than reality, and each one drove her deeper into anger and despair. The diary she kept no longer read like notes from a suspicious wife. It read like the unraveling thoughts of someone consumed by betrayal. Her quiet rage turned into a constant companion. She carried it to work, to the grocery store, and even into the silence of her own bedroom. It followed her in every breath, whispering that she had been replaced, that her life had been stolen from her. She didn't yet know what she would do, But she knew she couldn't remain trapped in this silent torment forever. What Claire couldn't see was how close she already was to breaking. The text had not only revealed James's secret, but it also planted something dangerous inside her, an obsession that was growing stronger with each passing day. It was no longer just about a betrayal. It was about control, about reclaiming. The life she felt had been taken from her. And though no one around her could see it, the quiet, patient woman they once knew was fading away, replaced by someone ready to do anything to end the torment. The storm that swept through Willow Creek on the night James disappeared seemed almost symbolic, as though the weather itself knew something terrible was about to unfold. Rain hammered the rooftops, the river swelled against its banks, and the wind carried a low howl through the streets. It was on this night that James left home and never returned. Claire told the police he had gone to meet a client, and at first, no one questioned her story. James was known for his long hours and dedication to work, so a late-night meeting didn't raise suspicion. But when his truck was found 2 days later near the riverbank, the keys still in the ignition, everything changed. Search teams fanned out, combing the muddy shoreline and the woods nearby. Helicopters hovered overhead, their light sweeping across the dark water, but there was no sign of him. The town buzzed with speculation. Some whispered that James might have left voluntarily, escaping the pressures of work and family. Others believed he had been the victim of an accident, perhaps swept away by the river during the storm. As hours turned into days, hope began to fade. Yet, for investigators, something about the scene didn't sit right. His truck showed no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no evidence that he had been forced out. The placement of the keys seemed deliberate, as if someone wanted it to look like he had walked away on his own. Attention slowly shifted back to the people closest to him, and naturally, Claire found herself under scrutiny. At first, she presented herself as a devastated wife. She stood by the river with neighbors, clutching her son's hand, her eyes fixed on the water as though she could will James to resurface. But behind her composed expression, small cracks began to show. Neighbors noticed how quickly she turned away when James's name was mentioned, or how often she avoided direct answers about the last time she saw him. Detectives widened their search beyond the river. That's when a neighbor came forward with footage from a security camera mounted above their garage. The grainy video showed Claire's car driving near the river late that same night, long after she claimed she had been home. The discovery shifted the tone of the investigation dramatically. Suddenly, Claire was no longer the grieving wife. She was a potential suspect. When police searched her home, they uncovered more troubling evidence. In the basement, tucked behind a storage shelf, they found a pair of muddy shoes. The soil clinging to the soles matched the same mud from the riverbank where James's truck had been abandoned. Alongside them was a torn piece of fabric that appeared to belong to James's jacket. The evidence wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to deepen suspicions. What truly unnerved investigators, however, was the discovery of Claire's diary. Neatly kept and spanning months, the entries painted a haunting picture of a woman unraveling. The pages began with small notes of doubt, suspicions about her husband's absences, and references to the mysterious text message. As the weeks went by, the tone shifted into anger, then obsession. She wrote about betrayal in vivid, almost violent terms, describing how the message had poisoned her thoughts. In the final entries before James's disappearance, her words grew chillingly specific, outlining her need to end the silence and erase the betrayal once and for all. Despite the mounting evidence, Claire denied any involvement at first. She insisted she had been home during the storm, asleep with her son upstairs. But the investigation had momentum now, and it seemed inevitable that the truth would soon surface. For the town, the possibility that a devoted teacher and mother could be capable of harming her husband was almost impossible to believe. Yet the pieces of the puzzle were aligning in a way that pointed to no one else. The search for James continued until, weeks later, his body was recovered miles downstream. The current had carried him far from the spot where his truck was abandoned. An autopsy revealed blunt force trauma, consistent with an attack, followed by drowning. It was no accident. James had not vanished into the storm by chance. He had been led there, and he had been silenced. The revelation sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The quiet town that prided itself on safety and familiarity was now the setting of a crime that felt both intimate and monstrous. Claire, once admired for her patience and warmth, was now at the center of a chilling narrative. A single text had started the chain of suspicion, and now a husband was dead, a wife was under suspicion, and the truth was closing in like the walls of a tightening cage. When the investigators placed the evidence before her, Claire's calm exterior began to erode. The shoes, the torn fabric, the diary, each piece stripped away the facade she had maintained for weeks. At first, she clung to denial, insisting that she was being framed or that the evidence was misunderstood. But as detectives pressed further, her story unraveled, and with it came a confession that stunned everyone who heard it. Claire admitted she had lured James to the river that night. She told him she wanted to talk, that she was ready to forgive, that they could fix what was broken. He believed her, perhaps relieved that his wife was willing to move past her suspicions. But when they stood by the rushing water, Claire's restraint collapsed. In her own words, she had been consumed by months of betrayal and humiliation, her anger sharpening into something uncontrollable. The storm drowned out the sound of their struggle, but it ended with James collapsing against the rocks, blood mixing with rain, and the river pulling him away. The confession rippled through Willow Creek like lightning. To the townspeople, Claire had always been a figure of trust and kindness. She taught their children, attended community events, and carried herself with quiet dignity. Now they struggled to reconcile that image with the woman who described pushing her husband to his death. Parents whispered about it at school pickups. Colleagues spoke of it in hushed tones, and neighbors avoided her house as though even its walls carried guilt. Yet Claire's words revealed something darker than a single moment of rage. She spoke of the text message as if it had cursed her, claiming it haunted her every thought. Investigators noted how she returned to it again and again, calling it the spark that destroyed her peace, the proof that James had betrayed her, and the seed that grew into her obsession. She insisted that she never planned to kill him, that it had been a crime of passion, not premeditation. But her diary told another story, one of preparation, calculation, and a slow march toward violence. The fallout extended beyond Claire and James. Emily, the young woman at the center of the affair, quickly became a target of anger and scorn. Though she had no direct hand in James's death, the community treated her as though she carried equal blame. She couldn't step into a grocery store without stares burning into her back. Strangers muttered insults as she passed on the street. Friends she once trusted withdrew, unwilling to be associated with her. Within weeks, Emily lost her job, her home, and the fragile sense of safety she had in the town. Eventually, she packed her belongings into her car and left Willow Creek behind, vanishing without a word. For James's family, the confession brought no closure. His parents wept openly during the hearings, grieving not only the loss of their son but also the destruction of their grandson's life. The boy had been shielded from much of the turmoil, but even at his young age, he understood that something terrible had happened. He asked questions no one could answer without breaking down. He clung to the memory of his father, unaware that his mother had been the one to take him away. The court proceedings were grueling. Prosecutors presented the evidence with precision, painting Claire as a woman who had carefully documented her rage until it consumed her. They read aloud passages from her diary, each word a knife that cut through any sympathy she might have had. The defense argued for leniency, framing her as a broken woman, betrayed and driven past reason by her husband's deceit. But the jury could not ignore the deliberate choices she had made, the deception that lured James to the river, the violence that followed, and the attempts to hide her involvement afterward. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom sat in silence. Claire Whitman was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She showed little reaction as the judge spoke, only lowering her head as though the weight of her actions had finally settled onto her shoulders. Outside the courthouse, the town seemed different. The same streets, the same houses, the same routines, but everything felt altered. Neighbors avoided one another's eyes. fearful of being drawn into gossip that had already torn apart lives. For months, the story dominated local conversations until it became less of a tragedy and more of a warning whispered to newcomers. Trust can shatter in an instant, and when it does, nothing remains untouched. By the end of the trial, 3 lives had been reduced to ashes. James was gone, Claire was imprisoned, and Emily had been exiled from the only home she had known. What began with a single text had spiraled into betrayal, obsession, and death, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal. Claire's sentence marked the end of the trial, but it was not the end of the story. The town of Willow Creek struggled to process what had happened, each person left to make sense of how a quiet family could unravel so completely. For months afterward, Claire's name lingered in conversations, carried in whispers across grocery aisles, murmured on front porches, and dissected in the pages of the local paper. It wasn't just the crime itself that unsettled people, it was the simplicity of what had sparked it. A single text, only a handful of words, had dismantled a marriage, claimed a life, and left a child without parents inside prison walls. Claire spent her days in silence. Her teaching days were over, replaced by endless routines that gave her too much time to think. She had become something she never imagined she could be, a cautionary tale. Some inmates avoided her, uneasy about the details of her case, while others pressed her for the story, fascinated by the idea that betrayal could lead a woman to such extremes. She never gave them much. Instead, she returned again and again to the thought of that message, replaying it in her mind until it was almost like a phantom voice she could never silence. She claimed she hadn't meant for James to die, that she only wanted him to feel the pain she carried. But the law had already defined her actions for what they were, and no amount of regret could change it. James's family tried to move forward, but grief clung to them like a shadow. His parents, once proud of the life their son had built, found themselves raising their grandson in the wake of tragedy. They shielded him from the harshest details, but as he grew older, the questions became more difficult to answer. Why wasn't his father coming back? Why couldn't he visit his mother anymore? Why did people at school look at him with pity? His childhood became marked by absence, defined not by what he had but by what had been taken away. Emily's life unraveled in a different way. Though she had not lifted a hand against James, the weight of the community's anger drove her away. She moved from town to town, seeking anonymity, but the past clung to her. She deleted social media accounts, cut ties with acquaintances, and lived quietly, always afraid that someone might connect her to the story that had destroyed everything. In time, she found work under a different name, but the shame never lifted. She was reminded daily that the choices she had made, however small they seemed at the time, had fed into a chain of events that ended in blood. For Willow Creek, the tragedy became a kind of legend. Newcomers were told the story as a warning, not in full detail, but in fragments. They were told about a family torn apart, about a woman who lost everything because she let suspicion consume her, about a text that should have been harmless but wasn't. The story was retold so often that it began to feel almost like folklore, a cautionary tale about love, betrayal, and the consequences of secrets. The more the story spread, the clearer the lesson became to those who whispered it. Destruction does not always come from violence at first. Sometimes, it begins quietly, with doubt taking root in the mind, fed by secrecy and silence. The message that appeared on Claire's phone had not drawn blood by itself, but it had opened a wound she could never close. From that wound came anger, from anger came obsession, and from obsession came death. Years later, when people looked back, they remembered James not as a victim of the river, but as a man swallowed by betrayal. They remembered Claire not as a teacher or mother, but as a woman who allowed her grief to twist into something lethal. And they remembered Emily as the outsider whose presence, however unintended, had set the stage for tragedy. 3 lives, bound together by one message, ended in ruin. The story of Willow Creek became a reminder that trust is fragile, and once broken, it can take everything with it. In the end, nothing remained of the Whitmans' once stable life. No future, no peace, only the echo of a text that had been sent in secrecy. It was proof that destruction doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it comes disguised as love, typed out in a few words, delivered in silence, and powerful enough to shatter everything in its path.